Now look, there are moments in American foreign policy that don't make the headlines they deserve, but they tell you something profound about how we're choosing to wield power on the world stage. And I want to talk to you today about one of those moments, something that happened just this week in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic that most Americans will scroll right past, but that carries consequences we'll be dealing with for years to come. On January 7, 2026, the United States Coast Guard seized the Russian-flagged oil tanker called the Marinera, formerly known as the Bella One, somewhere between Iceland and the United Kingdom. On the surface, this looks like straightforward law enforcement, stopping sanctions violators, cracking down on what they call the shadow fleet that moves oil for regimes we've sanctioned. But here's what concerns me. This isn't just about one rusty tanker. This is about America making a calculated decision to confront Russia's Navy in international waters over Venezuelan oil. And it's happening without the kind of international coalition building or legal clarity that has traditionally made American power legitimate in the eyes of the world. Let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the specifics matter. The United States Coast Guard cutter Monroe tracked this tanker across the Atlantic Ocean for more than 2 weeks, pursuing it through what naval officials described as treacherous winter storms. Vessel, carrying Venezuelan crude oil in violation of U.S. sanctions, was finally boarded and seized approximately 190 miles south of Iceland on January 7th. U.S. European Command confirmed the operation, stating the vessel was seized pursuant to a warrant issued by a federal court. The United Kingdom provided military assistance, deploying RAF surveillance aircraft and the Royal Navy support ship RF Tide Force to help with the operation. Now, this wasn't the only tanker seized that day. U.S. Southern Command announced it had also captured the M. Sophia, another sanctioned vessel in the Caribbean Sea. But it's the Marinera seizure that raises the most serious questions. And here's why. Russia didn't just condemn this action, but it deployed a submarine and other naval assets to escort this tanker across the Atlantic, according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal. Think about that for a moment. Russian military vessels shadowing an oil tanker in the North Atlantic, clearly anticipating American action, and we went ahead anyway. Well, let me tell you something about Russia's response, because we need to understand the other side's argument, even when we disagree with it. Russia's foreign ministry issued a sharp condemnation, calling the seizure a gross violation of international maritime law. Their transport ministry cited the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, arguing that no state has the right to use force against vessels properly registered under another state's flag. Some Russian news went further, calling it outright piracy. Russia's demands were explicit: immediate return of the vessel, humane treatment of the Russian crew members aboard, and respect for what they claim are established international legal frameworks. Now, look, I understand the irony here. This is the same Russia that invaded Ukraine in flagrant violation of international law, the same Vladimir Putin who has spent years tearing up the rule book when it suits his interests. The hypocrisy is rich, and nobody should take Moscow's legal arguments at face value given their track record. But here's the thing that troubles me, and this is important. Just because Russia is being hypocritical doesn't mean the legal question isn't real. Under what authority does the United States seize a Russian-flagged vessel in international waters based solely on American domestic sanctions law? That's a legitimate question that deserves an answer grounded in international law, not just in our own sense of righteousness. Is where I need to take a step back and explain something that most people don't understand about how the shadow fleet actually operates. Because if you don't grasp this system, you can't understand why this matters so much. What we're dealing with is a maritime shell game that's been going on for years. These shadow fleets, sometimes called dark fleets or ghost fleets, exist for one purpose: to move oil for sanctioned countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia without getting caught. They're typically older vessels, often past their prime, with deliberately opaque ownership structures running through shell companies registered in places like Turkey or Panama. They turn off their automatic identification systems, the transponders that normally let everyone track where ships are going. They change names and re-register under new flags every few months. They operate without the Bella One. The original name of this tanker was sanctioned by the United States Treasury in 2024 and not for minor infractions. American intelligence assessed that this vessel was carrying black market Iranian oil on behalf of some genuinely dangerous actors: the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Quds Force, Hezbollah, and Yemen's Houthi rebels. We're talking about a ship with documented connections to organizations that have American blood on their hands, groups that destabilize the Middle East and threaten our closest allies. So what happened? The ship got renamed the Marinera, and suddenly it's registered under the Russian flag, freshly protected by Moscow's diplomatic cover. That's the game. And these ships represent a fundamental challenge to the sanctions regime that every administration, Republican and Democrat, has relied on to pressure bad actors without going to war. Now, let me walk you through the tactical sequence of events step by step, because when you see the full picture, you start to understand the stakes. This operation began weeks before the actual seizure. U.S. intelligence have been monitoring the Bella One since it was sanctioned in 2024. When it reemerged as a Marinera under Russian flag in late December 2025, American forces began tracking it. On December 21st, 2025, the vessel left port, heading across the Atlantic toward Venezuela to pick up another load of sanctioned oil. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Monroe, a Legend-class cutter and one of our most capable vessels, began pursuit. For more than 2 weeks through winter storms and rough seas, the Monroe shadowed this tanker. During this time, according to the Wall Street Journal, Russia made its move. Moscow deployed a submarine and other naval assets to escort the Marinera, signaling clearly that they considered this vessel under their protection. On December 30th, crew members aboard the tanker literally painted a giant Russian flag on the side of the hull, a visible declaration that they were claiming Moscow's protection. By early January 2026, as the vessel moved between Iceland and the United Kingdom, the Trump administration made the decision to proceed with the seizure despite Russian naval presence. The United Kingdom was brought in to provide surveillance and support. On January 7, 2026, U.S. Coast Guard and Special Operations personnel boarded the vessel and took control. Almost simultaneously, U.S. Southern Command seized the M. Sophia in the Caribbean. President Trump's Energy Secretary Chris Wright announced that the United States would control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely, holding proceeds in U.S. accounts and essentially asserting American authority over another nation's primary export. Yes. Sometimes the multilateral process is slow and frustrating, but when we abandon that process, when we act like we can do whatever we want because we have the power to do it, we set precedents that will be used against us. We give other powerful nations permission to ignore international law when it suits them. We undermine the legitimacy that has always been America's greatest asset on the world stage. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires all of us, Democrats and Republicans, citizens and elected officials, to engage with these hard questions. To ask our leaders, what's your legal basis? Where are our allies? What's the end game? To insist on transparency and accountability, but most of us to think beyond the immediate satisfactions of looking tough and consider the long-term consequences of the precedents we're setting. The shadow fleet is a real problem. Sanctions evasion is a real problem. But solving those problems in ways that strengthen rather than weaken international law, that's the challenge of leadership. Third scenario, normalization of unilateral seizures. Maybe this just becomes the new normal. Major powers start seizing each other's vessels in international waters based on their own domestic legal justifications. China seizes ships they claim violated their sanctions. Russia does the same. International waters become a free-for-all where the only rule is power, where shipping companies have to navigate a minefield of competing claims and enforcement actions. That would represent a fundamental breakdown of the maritime order with massive implications for global trade and commerce. Fourth scenario, quiet diplomatic resolution. Behind the scenes, away from public view, diplomats from the United States, Russia, and perhaps intermediaries work out some arrangement. Maybe the vessel is eventually released under certain conditions. Maybe the crew is returned and Russia saves face while accepting that certain shadow fleet operations are too risky to continue. Maybe some kind of understanding is reached about red lines and areas where both sides will exercise restraint. This is what I hope happens, frankly. But if this is where we end up, it raises the question, why create this public confrontation in the first place? Why not pursue quieter enforcement methods that achieve the same goal without the escalation? Here's what I believe, and I want to be clear about the principles that should guide us. America has legitimate interests in enforcing economic sanctions against regimes that threaten our security and our values. Venezuela under Maduro has been a disaster, a corrupt dictatorship that has driven millions of people into poverty and exile. Russia under Putin has become an aggressive revisionist power that invaded a neighbor and threatens the entire post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. Iran continues to fund terrorism and destabilize the Middle East, using economic tools, including sanctions, to pressure these regimes is appropriate. It's a way to push back against bad actors without going to war. But here's what I learned in 8 years in the Oval Office, and it's something I think this administration needs to hear. How we exercise power matters as much as whether we exercise it. When America acts unilaterally, when we seize vessels without clear international legal process, when we can't articulate a strategy that our allies understand and support, we weaken the very system that has made American power effective and legitimate for decades. The international order, the institutions and norms and laws that govern how nations behave, wasn't created to constrain America. It was created largely by America after World War II because we understood that a world of rules benefits everyone, especially those who play by the rules. Yes, enforcing those rules is hard. Yes, bad actors will. Now, here's where I've got some serious concerns, and I want to lay out 3 specific questions that I think this administration needs to answer. First question, what is our legal basis under international maritime law for seizing a Russian-flagged vessel in international waters? We have domestic legal authority to our sanctions regime. Congress has given the executive branch broad powers to enforce economic sanctions, and federal courts issued warrants for these vessels. But the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Russia is citing, does establish rules about when you can board and seize vessels flying another nation's flag on the high seas. The convention generally holds that vessels on the high seas are subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of their flag state, with specific exceptions for piracy, slavery, unauthorized broadcasting, and situations where the ship is actually stateless, despite flying a flag. Did we consult with international legal experts to establish that this seizure falls within recognized exceptions? Are we arguing that the Russian flag registration was fraudulent, or are we simply saying that American sanctions law applies extraterritorial and we have the power to enforce it regardless of flag state? Because if it's the latter, we need to think very carefully about the precedent or setting. Second question, where is the international coalition? When I look at this operation, I see the United States and the United Kingdom acting together, which is significant. British support matters. But where are the other NATO allies? Where is the European Union, which has its own sanctions on Venezuelan oil? Where is the Organization of American States, which has been deeply concerned about the Maduro regime? When America acts with broad international support, when we can show that we're enforcing widely shared norms rather than just pursuing our own interests, our actions carry legitimacy that makes them sustainable. Unilateral American actions, even with one ally helping, look very different on the world stage than multilateral coalitions acting under clear legal frameworks. Third question, what's the strategic? The Trump administration has now stated explicitly that it will control Venezuelan oil sales indefinitely. That's an extraordinary claim, essentially asserting American control over another nation's sovereign resources for an unlimited period. Are we trying to force regime change in Venezuela? Are we trying to pressure Russia by disrupting its oil smuggling networks? Are we sending a message to Iran? These are very different strategic objectives with very different implications, and they require very different kinds of international support and legal justification. Let me talk about the broader implications for international law and order, because this is where things get complicated in ways that should concern every American. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, adopted in 1982, represents decades of negotiation to establish clear rules for how nations behave on the world's oceans. It defines territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and the high seas. It establishes when coastal states can exercise jurisdiction and when flag states have exclusive control. It's not a perfect system, but it's the system that has governed international maritime commerce for over 40 years. Now, here's the bitter irony I mentioned before. Russia is lecturing us about respecting the law of the sea while they've been violating international law in Ukraine for years, committing war crimes, ignoring territorial sovereignty, thumbing their nose at every principle of the international order. Vladimir Putin has zero credibility to complain about rule breaking. But the principle Russia is citing isn't wrong just because Russia is citing it. The question we have to ask ourselves is, under what authority does any nation seize another nation's flag vessel in international waters based on its own domestic laws? Because if we can do this to Russia, what stops China from doing it to us? What stops any powerful nation from deciding that its domestic laws apply in international waters and using its navy to enforce them? We could be looking at a fundamental erosion of the maritime legal order that has enabled global commerce and prevented conflicts at sea for generations.
There's also the question of escalation. Russia deployed submarines to escort this tanker.
We seized it anyway, despite their naval presence. What happens next time? Does Russia become more aggressive in protecting these vessels? Do we have a confrontation at sea where shots are fired? At what point does sanctions enforcement turn into something that looks a lot more like naval warfare? And all of this is happening while we're still dealing with the war in Ukraine, where U.S. policy toward Russia is already one of the most consequential foreign policy challenges we face. Now, let me talk about the domestic political context, because foreign policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Information must have looked appealing. Seizing Russian oil tankers, cracking down on sanctions violators, standing up to Putin and Maduro simultaneously. It projects strength. It shows action. It appeals to voters across the political spectrum who want to see America asserting itself on the world stage. Energy Secretary Chris White's announcement that we'll control Venezuelan oil indefinitely also serves domestic political goals. It positions the administration as taking command of a situation, promising to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry in a very profitable way, as President Trump said in a recent interview, suggesting American companies will benefit. There's also the Venezuela dimension. The Trump administration conducted a military operation in early January that resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro. That's a massive development in its own right, essentially regime change to military force. The tanker seizures fit into that broader strategy of asserting total American control over Venezuela's future. But here's what troubles me about this approach. It looks reactive, driven more by the opportunity to look strong than by a coherent long-term strategy. When I was in office, I learned that foreign policy is most effective when it's transparent, when Congress is consulted, when the American people understand what we're trying to achieve and why. When you spring major operations on everyone, when allies are surprised, when even your own party members in Congress are raising questions, as we saw this week with 5 Senate Republicans voting to limit the president's war powers in Venezuela, that suggests insufficient planning and coordination.
Let me lay out 4 possible scenarios for where this goes from here, because once you've taken action like this, you've set forces in motion that you don't entirely control. First scenario, escalation.
Russia has already positioned naval assets in the Atlantic and condemned this as piracy. What if they decide they need to respond to save face? What if Russian vessels start harassing American